Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And clearly the government has three missions, and one of them is highly relevant to today, really, absolutely what we want to talk about. But I would like to talk about and put narrative around the NHS today to give a sense of where we start from. One of the things missing, I think, in the narrative about the NHS is just how innovative it is. And my very courageous and very brilliant chief executive, Amanda Pritchard, captured a phrase once which was that the NHS is no longer the NHS of the iron lung. And that's quite true. And if you think about the NHS today, it is massively different than it was 5 years ago. And then the NHS was massively different than it was 5 years before that. And that was, again, different from 5 years before that. And why do I say that? Because all through its history, this innovation has been a sort of a strong feature of NHS delivery. So it was the first hip replacement, the first CT scan, the first combined heart and lung transplant, the first IVF baby, first heart surgery by remote-controlled robot. And today we continue to make significant advances in robotics. Nanorobotics, so we can now do individual cell repair, we can do brain aneurysm repair, actually with nanosurgical robots. In the last 18 months, liquid biopsy, the ability to pick up tumor shedding coming into the bloodstream has been remarkable. mRNA technologies, CAR-T, looking after sickle cell, potential real cures for that. Cytosponges, making endoscopy much more effective and efficient. Again, new technology. And then I come to the world of genomics. And what do we see in genomics? Well, last year, the NHS tested around 780,000 patients. And they tested either whole genome or panel testing or single gene testing. And we now scan for 200 cancers and 7,000 rare diseases in our genomics activity. And we're building a national genomics research library and a unified genomics record, and that NGRL, the research library, is well underway. We've signed off and completed on the 100,000 whole genome program, and we've just launched a program on newborn genomic sequencing in partnership with the clinicians in the NHS engaging with the families. And obesity drugs, we are looking to roll those out more actively. We are concerned around long-term impact, which we still don't properly understand, but we clearly do need to think very hard about how we roll these drugs out much more proactively because of the clear benefits that come to overall health from actually reducing the levels of obesity. And then AI, in terms of innovation. AI is actively pursued in the NHS. Again, it's not in the narrative, but we're using AI technology and techniques in ophthalmology and dermatology, so all the ologies in histology. We're doing brain scans, we're doing X-ray analysis and pattern recognition. AI is being used, and we're also experimenting in many parts of the NHS on what's called ambient documentation, which actually is voice to text, but it's voice to text which is more sophisticated. More sophisticated because it doesn't translate or transfer the clinician's diagnosis directly into the notes, which discharge notes and so on. But actually what it's really attempting to do is automatically download to the capturing systems. So actually the data systems beyond the notes for the patient will automatically be uploaded with actually that diagnosis, and the relevant systems will be fed. And then in more basic innovation, virtual wards. When I came into this role 2.5 or more years ago, one of the things that really excited me was the plan to move out of hospitals into the community. Virtual wards. What is it? It's a technology where you monitor the patient effectively at home. And the idea was to build between 40 and 50,000 virtual ward beds, very necessary in a constrained system, and we stopped at 12,000. Why have we stopped at 12,000? Actually, because I suspect it was less exciting to make an announcement that we've moved from 12,000 to 15,000 beds. We needed a shiny new toy that someone could announce, and so actually the capital funding for that very good program stalled. There are lessons in there, I think, about what do we choose to prioritize and how do we stay consistent. And then lastly, if I might, there's something called SDEX, same-day emergency care, really, really important. And these have rolled out again in the last 3 years, and we now have SDEX in 88% of our hospital trusts, which are open and run for 7 days a week for at least 12 hours per day. Now, all of that innovation, change in practice, change in technology, change in delivery isn't necessarily clear in the current narrative, but it's really important when you think about longevity and how we look after population health to remember that we have also to make the basic systems work. That then brings me, I think, to the fundamental challenge that the NHS has against a background of continued innovation, which is we have got to fix the basics. And the basics are under very, very real pressure. So Aradazi's very good report, excellent report, and probably had no surprises in it for those of us who work in the NHS. But what it did do, it brought together in one coherent narrative a picture of the current position of the NHS for everybody to read. And it was a very, very cogent and thoughtful piece of work. So what did he tell us? He told us capital underinvestment. And I can give you loads of stats. You don't want the stats, but we have in our data and technology budgets across the public sector more broadly, but certainly in health, capital budgets get raided all the time. Because in the public sector, different from my private sector experience, where you can't do this, actually, if you've got a shortfall in your P&L, you raid the capital and plug the shortfall. So data and technology budgets get raided, and we're underinvested. In our diagnostics, we have less than half the average capacity in diagnostic equipment than the OECD average. Less than half the average for the OECD in MRI, CT, and echo scanners. If I think about beds in the estate, you know these stats. The secondary bed capacity in England is 1/3 relative to population size. We have 1/3 the beds of Germany, half the beds of France, Italy, Spain. And so why do we think when winter comes, and we run at 96% occupancy all through the summer, when winter comes and the population gets more ill, actually that we get flooded, and it is a flooding issue. And if I told you that 2003, when the very able Alan Milburn stepped down as a very good Secretary of State, England had 144,000 beds. At the end of 2010, it was down at 122,000 beds, and today it's 97,000 beds. So the capacity to meet the population demand is very, very challenged. Second to capital, Aradazi talked about demand growth. The one brilliant thing he did, he showed us that our society is sicker. We have many more people in our population who are sicker, whether that's mental health or it's a consequence of obesity. But actually step away from that and just think about demand growth. I gave you a picture on bed capacity. Since 2001, the population of England has grown by 15%. Germany's grown by 2%, France has grown by 7%. So we've got a much bigger population. It's also older, and therefore greater morbidities, greater number of things to treat. 28% of the adult population is obese. It triggers 13 cancers, musculoskeletal, cardiovascular, diabetes 2, and that's a significant plague on our society. Mental health, children and young people presentations last year looking for mental health support rose 39%. 39% more children and young people coming at the NHS looking for help. So that demand growth is huge. And then the boundary with social care. We have this human capacity to create organizational structures. So we created a structure with a boundary between social care and health. And what we know is it's a false organizational boundary, but actually it is still a boundary. And the lack of fluency between care and health, particularly around discharge from secondary, we all know is a benighting challenge for us. And how do we manage that better? And particularly when both sides of that boundary are underinvested and under very significant pressure. And social care even more so, I think, than health. And that makes for huge challenges. Now, on longevity, One of the things that we have to all recognise, and it's how do we move from sort of sickness to prevention. Actually, the health service, causes of people coming into the health service are only about 20% directly related to health issues that we would naturally manage. And the majority, over 80%, come from other causes of ill health, whether it's deprivation or poor housing, cost of living crisis, social media pressures on mental health. So there's lots of things, factors out there that are creating the greater demand. And the NHS today has just opened its 15th gambling centre to deal with gambling addiction. Post the National Lottery Award and the explosion of online gaming, we have very high levels of gambling addiction. The NHS has to deal with that. And we've just opened our 30th centre to deal with severely obese children, 6 years old and younger. 30th centre. So what happens is, it's a bit like a terrible Gladiator, I should probably say Gladiator 1 film, which is whatever comes through those gates, the NHS has to deal with. So how do we get upstream and how do we change the health of the population? Now what I then say is that, and this is my more optimistic beat, in spite of these pressures, actually what's not recognised is that today the NHS is providing absolute record levels of healthcare to the population of England. Absolute record levels. So more than 1 in 10 of the population has an appointment in primary care every single week. Every single week. It's about 1 in 8 of the population has an appointment with primary care. Last year we did 3 million cancer referrals. 10 years ago it was 1.2 million. So actually we're seeing and doing more cancer referrals and cancer checks than we've ever done. And that grows month by month. Last year we did 17.5 million elective interventions, i.e. the waiting lists. We did 17.5 million. 10 years ago it was about 12 million. We're doing many more elective interventions, and that was to hold the waiting lists flat. And that was in spite of having to deal with industrial action, where we lost about what we postponed or rescheduled about 1.3 million interventions. So how do we go forward? Well, I think we go forward by focusing on very few enabling priorities. So we have a long-term workforce plan, first time ever in NHS history. But actually we have a long-term capital plan which shows if you steadily invest at these quantums in these areas, what will the NHS look like in 5 years and in 10 years' time. We have rolled out ICBs for the first time, and as they earn autonomy, depending upon their relative performance, they will transform the relationship with local communities and local need. We have a target architecture in our technology. I came to this role very surprised, no target architecture. To give you a sense for scale, last year the NHS transferred 44,000 platforms onto the cloud. 44,000 platforms onto the cloud. Think of the scale and the complexity of it. So we now have a target architecture, and we're rolling engineering principles so that any supplier of technology anywhere in the NHS has to meet a certain minimum standard, and therefore will build to minimum levels of coherence. We're concentrating on relatively few technologies at the centre. The NHS app, absolutely revolutionary. Federated data platform, interoperable data across the secondary system. Electronic patient records now in every primary care, virtually every primary care practice, and in about 98% of trusts. Capacity. I talked about beds. We have to think about capacity differently, thematically. So going to ageing population, 25% of the population is over 65. They represent 50% of admissions to hospital, and they represent 70%. So it's not quite 25, 50, 75, but it's easy to remember. 74% of bed occupancy, because they tend to stay longer. Now, instead of thinking about building more capacity all the time, we thought about how do we utilize that capacity, and we found ways to avoid elderly admission by getting secondary to go out into primary and find where the people are coming to them from. Then actually we can create capacity within a capacity-constrained system and therefore operate much more efficiently. And if I told you that 25% of the beds are occupied by patients with dementia, and half of whom are in with a UTI or chest infection, do not need treatment in hospital, actually, for that. If we could avoid admitting even half of those people, we would create 7 or 8% more capacity in our secondary systems and operate effectively. So I'm conscious of time. There are 2 other initiatives which are currently ongoing which are really important. One is a pilot on the new model of primary care. And if I told you that more than 30% of GPs are scheduled to retire, different dynamic than I'm a bit miserable, I'm leaving, I'm retiring, over 30% of GPs retire in the next 3 or 4 years. So there's a massive issue coming at primary care, so we're running new pilots on models of primary care provision. And the other one is a pilot running in 7 of the ICBs, over 20 of the primary care networks on frailty, mainly elderly people. But how do we look proactively at managing our older population to keep them out of hospital and to treat them better and more quickly? And those pilots are in good and advanced stages, and we're learning a lot. In the end, though, and I've had some trouble for making this next comment. So I was on a stage with Alistair Campbell recently. He told me that's why I'm not a politician. When I said, actually, do you know what I think? Bring on the nanny state. I'm sorry, bring on the nanny state. And I realise it causes all sorts of concerns about people's freedom as citizens. But we cannot continue in a system whereby our population get more and more ill, and we don't look out to try and prevent that. So where would we go? And the papers today are talking about social media regulation. Absolutely. Australia looking at under 16s, so should we. Smoking a vapes bill, I'd have made it tougher. Minimum alcohol pricing, do need to do that. We were worried for what it would do in Scotland. Actually, it's had hugely beneficial effects in terms of population health in Scotland. So I would bring on the nanny state. And as for ultra-processed foods, honestly, look at the ingredients on some of the slop that we eat. There's hardly any food in it at all. It's purely chemical slop. And it is making our population more and more ill. So I would, if I was the government, recognising population health, I would be more interventionist. I would ask Wes, who's our very able Secretary of State, I would ask Wes to have a mission, and the mission would be, could we conceive of a world where we were the fittest or healthiest nation in Europe? And to do that will require government legislation and intervention and us to fix the basics of the NHS. I do think, actually, that under Amanda Pritchard and Julian Kelly and the other executives in the NHS, what's missed, actually, is that in the last 3 years, what we've seen in every single constitutional measure across the NHS has been steady improvement. It's not enough. It's not enough. We aren't keeping up. We haven't caught up with the constitutional target levels we're meant to run at. But in each of the last 3 years, every single one of those measures has improved. And how does it do that? By steady operational management and pulling on the levers. But on its own, it's not enough. We need broader help at population health level. We need to engage upstream, and we certainly need, I think, to look at those causes of ill health and intervene before they get through the gates and have to be dealt with by the NHS. But thank you for listening to me. I hope it was interesting.